Hello, I'm Andy Agathangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Anthony Stansfeld in my capacity as Chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which provides the Secretariat to the All-Party Parliamentary Group. Anthony, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me.
Evening.
As you know, the conversation is being recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media and so on. You're carrying out this conversation with me, Anthony, on the basis that you've already provided a written submission to the APPG's call for evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority.
Yes.
Could I invite you, please, first of all, Anthony, to tell us about yourself and outline just briefly to begin with how you came to interact with the Financial Conduct Authority. Thank you.
I was the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Thames Valley for nearly 9 years, starting in 2013. Fairly early on in my time as the Police and Crime Commissioner, Thames Valley investigated and then prosecuted with the Crown Prosecution Service a massive fraud out of Reading within the HBOS Bank, Halifax Bank of Scotland. It was a very lengthy case, it took 3 years to investigate, and it transpired at the end of the case, the 6 defendants were all found guilty. They got 49 years in prison. And the fraud was prosecuted was about £245 million. In fact, the actual fraud was probably closer to £1 billion, but it doesn't really matter whether you prosecute 245 million or $1 billion, the sentences are not going to be any higher. But it was a massive case. If we'd prosecuted more, it would have just taken longer and the jury would have found it more difficult, I think, to understand the case. But obviously, I took a considerable interest in this case. And what I think came out very clearly at the end of it, that it was the tip of an iceberg. What was going on in the HBOS Bank was also going on out of certain branches of Lloyds and also on a very large scale out of Royal Bank of Scotland at Gega Bank in Edinburgh. So I followed this ever since, and I'm very disappointed that so far there's not been proper investigations by either the FCA or the National Crime Agency into what actually went on.
Thank you, Anthony. And question number 2, what is your interest in or connection with the Financial Conduct Authority?
Well, it was very clear that after the HBOS case, the Financial Conduct Authority had been aware of this for really quite a considerable time. And there was an internal report written in Lloyds by a lady accountant, senior accountant, Sally Masterton. She was asked to write it by the head of audit and risk within Lloyds. It's a remarkable document, it's 157 pages, and lays out clearly what was going wrong in Lloyds and the level of corruption. It names all the names and it names all the companies involved. This report, the FCA had it. I think, I can't remember the exact date, I don't have it with me, but certainly by 2015 they had it. And they sat upon this report and they did nothing about it. It is very, very clear. The report only actually became public when one of the defendants in the HBOS trial gave it to his local MP, who then passed it on to the All-Party Parliamentary Banking Group, who published it. I'd actually seen it beforehand, and I went up to see Mr. Bailey in London at his offices of the Financial Conduct Authority, and we actually discussed it, and I voiced my concern that both the FCA had neither done anything about the report, but worst of all, that Lloyds had just sacked the author of this report. They said the report was unsubstantiated. She had obviously slightly lost the plot. I can't remember the exact words that he used. Nobody had commissioned this report. It was just a solo effort by her. None of that was actually true. It was clearly commissioned, and I've got the emails that show that. I eventually, with others, I have to say, about 3 years later, got a compensation. But one of the FCA's jobs should be to look after the whistleblowers who come up with clear misconduct on the scale of this, and they have absolutely failed to do so.
Thank you again, Anthony. Briefly describe the interactions you've had personally with the FCA.
Well, I only had one personal meeting with the boss of it, which was Andrew Bailey. It was slightly, I find it slightly concerning that the chairman of the FCA, his previous job had been senior partner of KPMG when they audited the HBOS accounts, the Carillion accounts, and the co-op accounts. And I also find it very disconcerting that an awful lot of the members of the Financial Conduct Authority actually were past employees of Lloyd's, so a lot of them were virtually investigating themselves, which I found very difficult. We had a number of emails. I don't have all those emails. They're on my previous IT system, which Thames Valley Police now hold. But I have a hard copy of some of them, and there was quite a considerable correspondence over this with the Financial Conduct Authority. And as I said, as far as I know, absolutely no action was taken.
Question number 4, Anthony. In broad terms, what have your dealings with the FCA been like?
Well, I think they've been cordial and unsatisfactory is probably the very simple answer to that one.
And question number 5, have you ever witnessed any actions or conduct that, in your reasonable belief, breached any law, regulatory code, or applicable or relevant policy?
I think it's a difficult one. I mean, as far as I can see, the Financial Conduct Authority, the senior members of it, knew perfectly well what had been going on, both in Lloyd's and in HBOS and in RBS, and they did nothing about it. An action should have been taken, and I think that probably constitutes, I'm not a lawyer and I don't know the legal ins and outs, but probably constitutes misconduct in public office, I would have thought.
Thank you, Anthony. Number 6, have you ever experienced situations where interacting with the FCA has been helpful to either yourself or others?
I can honestly say I don't think I have, no.
And number 7, what are your thoughts on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers that it already has?
I think it's the latter. I think it has ample powers. I don't think they are properly used. And I think one of the problems also is that we have so many regulatory authorities, not only ones like the FCA, sort of national ones, the FRC, the National Crime Agency, the PRA. I can go on quoting you acronyms all day. But then you also have things like the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, which are the trade bodies. And they all have overlapping responsibilities, and there is the ability to shuffle them around between each other, and actually nobody will pick up and run with a clear case of major misconduct and fraud.
Understood. And question number 8, have you experienced any difficulties or shortcomings in your interactions with the FCA?
Well, other than they didn't take action, and I clearly thought it was needed, and they didn't protect the whistleblowers. I think they had all the evidence. I think the information was there and they had the powers and they failed to use them. But as I said, I've had cordial relationships with them, but thoroughly unsatisfactory relationship.
Thank you. And next question is, have you experienced the FCA being reluctant to give clear answers to questions?
Yes, I think I have. I mean, there's a clear question, which was clearly asked, is why have you done nothing about the Sally Masterton Turnbull report, which laid out clear failings within Lloyd's. But also, it goes a little bit further than that. We've now had this inquiry by, I think, a very eminent retired judge named Linda Dobbs and a team of very competent people that has gone on since 2017. It was meant to be a short report, and it was commissioned by Lloyd's themselves, and they get the report. Well, this shouldn't have been Lloyd's responsibility. It was clearly the responsibility of the Financial Conduct Authority. This is them investigating themselves, and I have no doubt at all about the honesty of the members of this board, but it has gone on now for 5 years. And what is apparent is every stone they unturned, they are finding more. And what concerns me about this report is that when it is finally issued, now it's apparently going to come out next year, but we've heard that for the last 2 years, is what happens to it then? It will be immediately hidden. It will go up to Lloyd's lawyers, Herbert Smith Freehills. I have very little doubt they will sit on it for a very long period of time while it's redacted, And when it eventually becomes public, it will be so long that most of the victims will have probably passed away. And I don't think that should have happened. But why is it being done by Lloyds? This should have been done by the Financial Conduct Authority, quite clearly. And it's this sloping of shoulders and responsibility that I find so difficult.
Thank you again, Anthony. Question number 10 for you. What is your perception of the culture of the FCA? What do you think about the FCA's culture?
Well, I said I've never worked in it, so it's slightly difficult to be very specific about it. But I think that, while it is prepared to take on some big companies and has done, though usually with not great success, I have to say, it is very, very reluctant to take on banks. And this is possibly because those banks are in part owned by the government itself. And there is quite a lot of pressure. I don't know where it comes from. The senior civil servants, I rather suspect, not to investigate major banks, especially if the public own those banks. And I can't remember what the shareholding of the two banks are, but it's very large in RBS. And I think it's down to about 25% in Lloyds, which now calls itself the National Westminster Bank, because it's slightly cleaner name than Lloyds. But yes, there is obviously a clear reluctance to investigate these major frauds. And the worry is that if Financial Conduct Authority won't do it, and the National Crime Agency has never investigated a single fraud that I'm aware of, and the police simply cannot afford to do this. I mean, the HBOS case cost Thames Valley £7 million. And though Lloyds was eventually fined 45 million, reduced from 65 million because they cooperated with the FCA, well, they certainly didn't cooperate with Thames Valley Police when we were running the case. But that money went straight to the Treasury. Not one penny came back to Thames Valley Police. And that is a huge bill for a police force. In fact, the Home Office did cough up, I think, £2 million, which was very good of them, but it shouldn't have been the Home Office. It should have been the Treasury that paid that bill. We were still down £5 million. And the one lesson that comes out of that for police forces, which are largely much smaller than Thames Valley, which is one of the biggest forces in the country, is that it is simply not possible financially to prosecute a major bank, so nobody will do it. And a bank is merely petty cash to a bank, this. They're spending their shareholders' money, not their own personal money, to defend themselves. And so the police don't investigate it, and that needs sorting out, I think, fairly quickly.
Thank you, Anthony. Question number 11. Have you ever complained about the FCA in some way?
Yes, I have. I've complained very loudly up to the Prime Minister about it. When I wrote to the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, and it was, I think, a difficult time for her, and I set it all out in a letter, which I've kept copies of, saying that we have a major problem in the banks. And she had actually asked the Police and Crime Commissioners if we had a major problem with anything, would we raise it with her personally, which I did. And it was passed to the Cabinet Secretary at the time. And I got a very nice letter back from him saying, these are very serious allegations. Would you like to come and discuss them with me? My staff started to organize this with him. I then got a short 2-line letter from him saying, I've taken advice on this and I've been advised not to talk to you, which I find the most extraordinary letter ever. And I wrote back and said, who's asked you and who's advised you not to talk to me? And he wouldn't reply to that letter. And I have all that correspondence.
And question number 12, what do you think about the possibility of conflict of interest issues at the FCA?
Well, there are clear conflicts of interest. I already expressed the one that the chairman was from KPMG who audited the HBOS accounts. But I think so many of the people who work for this are investigating the very banks and organizations that they themselves were in. And they're either investigating themselves or their friends. And I think it is a very difficult one, this, that you need the experts. But you've got to be very careful what they're investigating and do they have a conflict of interest? And I think the FCA is absolutely riddled with conflicts of interest.
Question 13, Anthony. Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the spot checks by VAT inspectors?
Yes, I think they probably should, but I think what they actually want to regulate as well is what they know perfectly well has been happening.
And the next question, what positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to comment on?
Well, I'm pleased we have an FCA, but I can't think of anything very positive that I've seen it's done. I think one of the problems, and I go back to its governance and its leadership. I mean, originally, I can remember, I think it was in the early 80s, when a lot of the regulatory bodies were being set up to look into the city and what was going on, the city actually went outside somebody very closely involved with it, and an army brigadier was put in to do the job, Brigadier Jebins, and he did a very, very competent job. I think the city were a bit surprised to find they had an army brigadier when he actually stopped, I think it was the Norwich Union, selling insurance, because he said, your salesmen are not doing this properly and are basically misleading people. And they have all got to do a course that I will set, and you can't sell insurance until they did. And then for a time, the predecessors to the FCA were actually run by two army brigadiers. And then the city decided it could do the job itself, and we had the FSA and now the FCA. I don't think either have performed remotely well. I think there are too many conflicts of interest.
Thank you. And question number 15, Anthony. If you could change 3 things about the FCA, what would they be?
Well, I think you've got to stop the revolving door between the FCA and those it's regulating. And that is clearly happening on the employment side. I think you've got to get a properly independent chair and CEO, which I don't think has always happened in the past. I'm not going to comment on what's there at the moment. And if it requires it, it must have a much larger budget to do the job properly.
Question number 16. The FCA is undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments to make about that?
Well, I think it's got to be careful not to make rules that just suit itself. I think the rules ought to be set independently of it. It shouldn't be an internal review making up its own rules. And I think this business of overlapping responsibilities with other regulatory bodies needs sorting out. I think it should be very, very clear exactly what it is meant to look into and how it does it. And at the moment, I don't think it is clear.
Question number 17. Are there any other comments that you'd like to make?
Well, I think the main comment I have is that major fraud is not being investigated at all at the moment. I've given you the reasons why the police don't investigate fraud. They haven't got the expertise, they haven't got the money. The FCA doesn't really investigate fraud from what I've seen. The NCA doesn't. Who does investigate fraud? And I think there's got to be proper money put into this. And my recommendation for quite a long time has been that the police investigate counterterrorism and serious organized crime at the high levels, not at police force level, but at regional level. So you have the Southeast region or the Northeast region, and they have a central body that looks at the very serious end. I think there should be a third arm to that, which should be major fraud. And it shouldn't be largely police officers, it should be independent accountants with a few police officers, and they should look at the major frauds. It needs to be financed properly. The police budget, I don't think, should bear the cost. It shouldn't be a Home Office budget. It should be a Treasury budget. I think that needs probably about 300 million a year put into it, but it would pay for itself extremely quickly. And it should be, once it's set up, totally independent of the Treasury and of government and of the companies, and there should be no conflicts of interest.
Anthony, thank you very much indeed for providing, first of all, your written submission and also taking time with me today to provide your verbal testimony as you have done. As explained earlier, your video evidence will be added to the APPG's website alongside your written testimony. Anthony Stansfeld, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.